Every single insomniac is different. But for many of us, when we lie awake at night worrying about bad things happening, we often envision those things happening at night. That bad news happens at 3 a.m, when our world is at its darkest, and the sound, the thunder of a text, the scream of a phone will pierce the otherwise silent and still night. Because bad things don't happen on beautiful mornings. Nobody dies to the sounds of chirping birds. The comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee can't mingle with the acrid smell of smoke from a gun, or a paper bag with someone's uneaten breakfast, tightly clutched, still warm, in a cold hand. But tonight's episode is about a dark impulse that took the life of another on a bright and sunny spring day. A murder on a Sunday morning. A devastating crime that took just 5 seconds, and a murder that would take 2 lives along with it. The woman who was killed, and the child, really, who confessed to doing it. It's a stunning murder case with an even more shocking outcome, and a criminal trial that was chronicled in one of the most groundbreaking documentaries of its time. The 2001 feature documentary titled Murder on a Sunday Morning. A game-changing documentary made by a film crew who stumbled into the story, and directed by a French filmmaker named Jean-Xavier de L'estrade. And this documentary, initially, was made for and only supposed to be seen in Jean-Xavier's native country of France. But after it was finished, it would go on to receive international acclaim, winning an Academy Award for Best Feature Documentary in 2002. An achievement that would change the trajectory of Jean-Xavier de Lestrade's career, when Jean-Xavier decided to make a second documentary, a sweeping docuseries that would go on to define true crime storytelling well into the 21st century. Another shocking real-life murder mystery. This one about a woman named Kathleen Peterson who was found at the bottom of the stairs in the high-profile murder trial of her husband, Michael Peterson. A twisty-turny saga that would span 13 years and 13 episodes in a series called The Staircase. If you're listening to this podcast, you likely know The Staircase. But you may not know Murder on a Sunday Morning. And even though that documentary won an Oscar and was distributed by HBO, for a while it was hard to find. And now you can find it in a couple of places, and I'll share those places in the show notes. Because Murder on a Sunday Morning belongs in the true crime canon. One that makes for a complicated and compelling story for tonight's episode. This is Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, and if you are new to the podcast, I created Dead Sleep to preserve the integrity of 2 things I feel passionately about: good quality true crime storytelling and a good quality night's sleep. Can those 2 things exist together? That's honestly for you to decide. Because Dead Sleep is 100% ad-free and listener-supported, which means this show only exists because of you, the listener. I do my best to create episodes you can listen to over and over again, and in fact, most people listen to each episode of Dead Sleep roughly 4 to 5 times, which makes me very happy. And I'm pleased to announce something else. It's something that I must warn you might make you uncomfortable, because it makes me uncomfortable. But it's important for both of us to hear it. Ready? Here goes. Ugh, that was rough. 5 whole seconds of silence. 5 seconds can seem like a long time. But silence, I'm learning, is important for us to enjoy in a loud world. And when I first started this show, I tended to have lots of music and sound effects to enhance storytelling. And with each episode, I learned more and more about how to make that balance work. But I wanted to explore a version of this show without all of those literal bells and whistles. So I created a special version of the show I'm calling Dead Sleep Naked. That is existing episodes of Dead Sleep with no music, no sound effects, just my voice. This is made for people who are sensitive to sound, who are maybe hearing impaired, or just want to listen to my voice au naturel. And thanks to you subscribers, I was able to afford the opportunity to remaster some of my favorite episodes to ensure that they would work on their own. And these au naturel episodes of Dead Sleep Naked are included in your paid subscription and will be made available on Patreon, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts beginning in early May. So with that, let's settle in for the night and travel back in time to early Sunday morning, 7 a.m. on May 7th, 2000. Where an older couple stood outside a Ramada Inn in Jacksonville, Florida. That couple, their names were James and Mary Ann Stevens, and they were tourists visiting from Georgia. They appeared to be getting an early start to their day, returning from breakfast with Mrs. Stevens clutching a hot cup of coffee and a to-go cup in her hand, and a handbag slung over her shoulder. And it was there in the motel parking lot, in the bright light of a spring morning. A man appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and standing directly in front of the couple and holding a gun. The man asked Mrs. Stevens, no, he told Mrs. Stevens to give him her purse. Standing just a couple of feet away, Mr. Stevens got a good look at that gun. The gun was a pocket pistol, a Derringer, appreciated by amateurs and enthusiasts alike for its concealability and ease of use. The Derringer had been around since the early 1800s, the pistol of the Old West. Slim enough for a gunslinger to slide into the side of a boot, pretty enough for a saloon gal to tuck into one of her garter belts, a practical accessory. A Derringer is the gun from the days of fabled outlaws and trusty sheriffs, when the way to solve a murder was gathering a posse and hunting down the varmint who did it, ensuring swift justice with a noose around the neck and hanging him high for the town to see. These days, from a distance, a Derringer is so small it looks like a child's toy, but at close range, it was plenty deadly. It was the Derringer that John Wilkes Booth used when he shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head from just a few feet away. And now, here in Jacksonville, over 100 years later, Mr. and Mrs. Stevens and the man with the gun, they stood face to face. And what transpired between the three that triggered the gunman to pull the trigger on that Derringer? Who knew? But with a simple squeeze and a single pop, the man shot Mrs. Stevens, the bullet hitting her just above the bridge of her nose, killing her almost instantly. And then, as quickly as he appeared, the man snatched the purse and sprinted away, disappearing somehow in that broad daylight. When the police arrived and asked Mr. Stevens what happened, he swore he got a good look at the guy. He described him as a black male, maybe between 20 to 25 years old. He was tall, at least 6 feet, and thin. He wore blue shorts, had skinny legs, and wore a blue shirt, maybe with a collar. And his hair was covered with a fisherman-style bucket hat. And with that bit of information, the police went to work, forming a kind of modern-day posse, as police cars went around the neighborhood, searching for that varmint who fit the description. And fortuitously, not too far from the Ramada Inn where the incident happened, they saw a man walking down the street who matched that description. They called the man over, who, up close, wasn't a man at all. He was a 15-year-old boy, a teenager, who had apparently been walking to a Blockbuster, he said, to pick up a job application. Police told him that there had been an incident nearby, and they asked if he might be able to help them. The kid said sure, he'd be happy to help. But more accurately, he likely said, yes, sir. Because Jacksonville, Florida is still very much part of the South. And in the South, a teenager addressing an adult, especially one in authority, it would have been always, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. That is, if a kid was raised right. And this boy, he was raised right. He told the police his name was Brenton Butler, and he lived with his parents and little brother, not too far from here. If the officers had a checklist of their suspect, they would have noticed maybe that they were missing a few details. That this boy wasn't between 20 to 25 years old, not even close. Or that he wasn't even 6 feet tall, he was 5'10". And his build, he wasn't skinny. He wore glasses. Just about everyone in his family wore glasses. And Brenton wore his glasses all the time. That wasn't mentioned in Mr. Stevens's witness statement. And he wasn't wearing a dark shirt with a collar. He was wearing a t-shirt with a Nautica logo on it. Furthermore, he wasn't wearing a hat. He wasn't carrying a gun. And he didn't appear to have a stolen purse. But he did have $91 in his pocket, which authorities found suspicious. Mr. Stevens might have been wrong about the height, but Brenton could have changed his appearance since the robbery. Changed his clothes, used the glasses as a disguise, thrown the purse and the gun somewhere. Maybe they were just a couple of young cops doing due diligence. Whatever the case, one of the cops asked Brenton to please get inside the police car. And of course he did. Yes, sir. With Brenton in the back of that vehicle, they drove back to the Ramada Inn, the crime scene. The officers went and fetched Mr. Stevens, and they brought him to the police car. They opened the door to the police car where, in the back, sitting down inside, was Brenton Butler. And they asked the man, Mr. Stevens, was this the man who shot your wife? Mr. Stevens didn't have to look very long. He would know that face from 50 yards away. That was the man who shot his wife. And the cops asked Mr. Stevens, was he sure? Mr. Stevens said with confidence, yes, he was sure, because if he wasn't, he would never let an innocent man go to jail. And with a suspect in custody and a positive ID from their sole witness, they took Brenton from the crime scene to the police station, where detectives were ready for Brenton, where they'd ask him a few important questions, but mostly demand answers. At first, Brenton insisted he was innocent, but over the next several hours, the savvy detectives did manage to coax an admission that he had indeed shot Mrs. Stevens. It was a robbery gone wrong. And by the end of the day, they had Brenton write a confession. And with that written confession, their work here was done. Brenton Butler was charged with murder and taken away to a juvenile detention center. And the police were lauded for their efficiency, and authorities could assure the public that any tourists who were going to come to Jacksonville, they needn't worry. These streets were safe. It all happened so fast. The full story, from the shooting to the suspect to the confession, was in the newspaper the very next day. That was Monday, May 8th, 2000, when a man named Patrick McGinnis found out about this whole murder the same way everybody else did, on the front page of a newspaper. Maybe that was good news for the rest of Jacksonville, but for Pat McGinnis, this was bad. Because Pat McGinnis was a Jacksonville public defender. And this was the first he was hearing about this case. And all of those little red flags he would have as a public defender, they were right there in the newspaper, spelled out in black and white. That a white woman in her early 60s, a tourist from Georgia, visiting Jacksonville with her husband, was shot and killed outside of a Ramada Inn that previous morning. And that the shooter, a 15-year-old black teenager named Brenton Butler, had been identified by the victim's husband, Mr. James Stevens, and taken into custody. And it was while in custody that Brenton Butler confessed to the killing. The question for everyone now was, with Brenton Butler so obviously guilty, should they even bother with a criminal trial? Or would it be best for everyone, for the Stevens family, for the taxpayers, if Brenton just took a deal? Maybe life in prison? That seemed fair. After reading that article in the newspaper, Pat got in his car and lit a cigarette, one of many he'd have that day, and he exhaled with a sense of disgust and frustration as noxious as the secondhand smoke that filled the air. In less than a day, Pat McGinnis realized 2 lives had been thrown away. The life of the victim, Mrs. Stevens, and the whole future of that teenage boy. Pat didn't know Brenton's side of the story, but it was obvious in the clean narrative in the newspaper, the arrest, the confession, that it was case closed, basically, tied up in a neat little bow. It was too neat. It didn't appear that Brenton had had a lawyer, and he most definitely needed a lawyer, because this case was moving at a lightning pace. Patrick worried they were running out of time. So that very day, that May 8th, Pat McGinnis made his way to the Jacksonville Detention Center to meet with Brenton and get his side of the story. And face-to-face with Brenton, the story that he told wasn't neat or in a bow. And that's when Pat realized this murder case was a mess. And it was far from over. Pat McGinnis was just getting started. And it was around that same time when French filmmaker Jean-Xavier de L'estrade and his producer were on what you might call a fishing expedition. They were fishing for a good story, some good material for a documentary about the American legal system, which the 2 Frenchmen found fascinating. Because the French criminal justice system and the American criminal justice system were strikingly different. The biggest and most entertaining difference was the French versus American court trial, In France, the judge plays an active role in the court proceedings, acting in part as a lead investigator. Here in the U.S., that gathering of evidence is up to the prosecutor. In France, it seems the goal, at least in theory, was for the judge to find the truth. And the whole process in France is more of an inquiry, where here in the United States, we function on an adversarial system that's two sides, the prosecution and the defense, arguing before a jury, and the judge is there as legal referee. And it's that battle between the attorneys, the prosecution and the defense, the inherent conflict that would make for a potentially juicy drama for a documentarian. There was talk of the French filmmakers getting access to a big law firm, but nothing came of it. Who would allow a documentary crew to follow their every move of some high-profile case? Who'd be willing to risk their career, their image, their livelihood, if the whole thing went sideways? The answer to those questions wouldn't be found in a white-shoe law firm, but between the dingy walls of the Duval County Public Defender's Office, where the then 49-year-old chain-smoking, straight-talking, ginger-haired attorney, Patrick McGinnis, had no problem shining a bright light on his case, the murder trial of Brenton Butler. In fact, he welcomed it. Because the more you dug into this case, the darker and more rotten things got. Hearing about what happened to Brenton, one almost hoped that he wasn't telling the truth. Because if he was telling the truth about what happened to him, it suggested a conspiracy. So dirty and corrupt. Anyone who would try and fight it, like Brenton Butler, was doomed. That day in May, when Patrick McGinnis would first meet Brenton, he didn't see a killer. He saw a terrified kid with a big raised bruise over one of his cheeks, like he'd been punched. The injury had looked so fresh you had to wonder if maybe, unfortunately, Brenton had learned some hard lessons overnight in that juvenile detention center. But no. Brenton explained where he got that bruise. That it all started the morning before. The way he remembered it was somewhere around 9 or 9:30 in the morning. Brenton left his house to walk to the local Blockbuster, the video store, to pick up a job application. Brenton's parents were hardworking, and they had their own house, but there wasn't a lot of room for extras. So Brenton liked to have a part-time job so he could afford the things that he wanted, like a new pair of sneakers. Brenton hadn't reached the Blockbuster yet when the police car pulled over. And that's when a pair of uniformed police officers asked for his help. And Brenton agreed to get in the police car, though he didn't know how he could really help anyone. And once they reached the Ramada Inn, he had no idea why he was there, or why they had brought out this older white guy who would later find out was Mr. Stevens, and why Mr. Stevens was pointing at him. He had no idea he was a suspect in an armed robbery and murder of an older white lady, Mrs. Stevens. Or why he would be, until he was taken to the police station, where he was interviewed by local detectives. Interviewed wasn't quite the word. He was harangued, intimidated, and threatened. Men who insisted he was the shooter. And the quiet and confused Brenton insisting he wasn't. The detectives had told him his parents were informed about what had happened and where he was. And maybe seeing Brenton's fear, or perhaps it was a bid to get him to talk, one of the detectives assured the boy that they'd help him get in touch with an attorney. Neither one of those things turned out to be true. For hours, Brenton's parents had no idea where he was, and no attorney was ever arranged. Not a single phone call made, even though the public defender's office was steps away, near the local courthouse. Patrick or one of his colleagues would have been right there. But they weren't. And as the hours went by on that Sunday, with Brenton all alone, stoically but stubbornly insisting he was innocent, the homicide detectives grew frustrated because they hadn't found the gun yet, no Derringer, or even the purse. But they were under pressure to get this case, a murder involving a tourist, cracked. Everybody knew Brenton was guilty. They just needed to have Brenton's confession. After hours of frustration, the detectives called in the big gun, the king of confessions, Detective Glover. Detective Glover was confident for a few key reasons. One, he was a trained interrogator. He'd taken professional courses on the art of manipulating a suspect to get that person to confess. And two, unlike the other investigators, Detective Glover was black, and he believed that Brenton would be relieved to see him and likely open up. And three, unlike the other investigators or anyone else on the whole police force, Detective Glover was special, virtually untouchable. One big, giant, oversized Nepo baby, whose father just happened to be Nat Glover, the first African-American man to be elected sheriff in all of Florida since Reconstruction. And his father was a true pioneer and widely regarded as a hero. Detective Glover was an otherwise unremarkable cop who somehow, coincidentally, was promoted to homicide detective right around the time his father became sheriff. And maybe that explains why Detective Glover didn't feel like he had to play by the usual rules. He was a maverick, and his methods may be unorthodox, but they got results. On that Sunday, at least according to Brenton, this included a little field trip. Detective Glover explained to Brenton that they were going on a trip to the woods. These woods weren't too far from that Ramada Inn, and in those woods, Detective Glover believed that was where they would find the Derringer and the purse, because that's where Brenton hid them when he was making his quick getaway, wasn't it? Admit it. So the whole posse went to the woods, the detectives, some police officers, and Brenton. Brenton had never been in any kind of trouble. He'd never had any run-ins with the police. He was naturally a standoffish kind of child, so he didn't get himself in too many scrapes. Both of his parents were deeply religious, and Brenton grew up in a close-knit church community. This, for him, was his first experience of being in trouble. And it seems the detectives made quite a show out of it. By then, they'd taken all of his clothes for evidence, and he wore the bright orange county jail uniform of an inmate. On top of that, they secured Brenton, handcuffing his wrists together, shackling his ankles together, and holding it all together with a belt they put around his waist. So when he moved, he had to do so in a tiny little shuffle, the metal and chains clanging and clanking with every tiny step. To some, it might have seemed like overkill. But overkill, that was Detective Glover's M.O. If they hurried, they could make those woods by sundown. And this little Brenton son of a bitch would break. There's a special kind of daylight just before sunset, where everything is bathed in this soft, soothing, golden, glorious light. Photographers call it the magic hour. And it was around that time, the magic hour, that Brenton trudged through the woods, hobbling alongside Detective Glover, as the rest of the team, mysteriously, stayed behind. And it was as if Detective Glover himself expected magic, that he wanted Brenton to somehow find a purse and a gun and pull it out of thin air. Brenton had no idea what he was talking about. And as the sun set and the golden hour vanished, it was just him alone in the dark woods with that detective. And that's when Detective Glover used his most effective techniques in securing a suspect's confession. The detective, who was also a one-time boxer, punched Brenton in the face. And when that didn't yield the result he wanted, Brenton said Detective Glover shoved him and punched him, punching him so hard in the stomach, he sank to his knees. Brenton still had the bruises on his stomach and sternum. Physical evidence, proof that it really happened. And Detective Glover made it clear, the way it was going to be. Like something out of a movie, that there was an easy way and a hard way. And didn't Brenton want the easy way? And by the time they made it out of those woods, and were back in view of the other detectives in the team, Detective Glover was satisfied. A job well done. He let them know that Brenton here was ready to confess. Back at the police station, Brenton now sat side by side with a senior lead detective who helped him find the words for that confession. Slowly, one word at a time, they shaped what happened. The detective made sure it was all Brenton's words. He was just helping him spell it out and secure that crucial timeline, that it was sometime between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. that Brenton had left his house, robbed Mrs. Stevens, shot her, and then disposed of the gun and the purse before going back home, apparently changing his clothes, then walking back out to that Blockbuster to pick up that job application as a cover for what he'd done. And with that, Brenton signed the confession. And when finally he was able to speak with his mother, the typically reserved Brenton broke down in uncontrollable sobs. That he didn't do it, but he'd signed this paper, and he was going to go to prison for the rest of his life. Of course, when Jean-Xavier de L'estrade heard about all of this from Pat McGinnis, he knew it was the documentary they needed to make. This was more than a legal drama. It was a battle of good versus evil. And later in 2000, when that case went to trial, the French film crew was right there in the courtroom, capturing all of it. Which side would win? Innocence and truth? Or power and lies? Swearing to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. That oath, it dates back to the Middle Ages, back in England. And even now, in these cynical times, Americans still take this whole truth and nothing but the truth pretty seriously. And in this particular case, in the murder trial against Brenton Butler. This oath was more important than ever, because this case really would come down to who the jury believed: the alleged killer or the police. One word against another, because at that time, interrogations weren't recorded. There were no body cameras on the police. CSI wasn't particularly advanced, so something like DNA evidence and finding the answer through science wasn't really available. This was a matter of testimony and believability. What's more, as Pat McGinnis dug into the actual investigation, the police work was so thin, there wasn't much evidence. The gun had never been found. In the purse, it had been found, in a dumpster, roughly 9 miles away from where the incident took place. But the purse, at that time, had never been dusted for fingerprints, which sounded like this case would go in Brenton's favor. But back in 2000, witness testimony was powerful. In the criminal trial, Mr. Stevens took the stand and swore under oath that it was indeed Brenton Butler who killed his wife. He was certain of it. And then, of course, there was Brenton's full signed confession. The jury back then likely wondered, who would confess to something they didn't do? And when Brenton Butler himself took the stand, he seemed credible and honest. But there was so much he didn't know. All he could tell was the terrible things that had happened to him the day he was arrested. Things that most people wouldn't believe. Who was he? He was just some teenage kid caught in a bad situation. And who were they? They were the Jacksonville Police Department. What reason did they have to grab the wrong guy? It was when Detective Glover took the stand that the story took a strange turn. That in Detective Glover's version of events, he and Brenton were buddies. Detective Glover claimed that when he walked into the interrogation room, it was Brenton who said he was so glad to see him, and early on broke down in tears, giving him a hug, and essentially confessing that he hadn't meant to shoot her. It was an accident. Detective Glover swore on the stand that this happened. But Pat McGinnis, over time, was able to peel away the layers of deception. And it wasn't difficult to find the many flaws in the entire investigation. And when the jury went to deliberate, they came back 45 minutes later. The verdict was not guilty. This, of course, was an incredible victory for Brenton and his family, and for Pat McGinnis and his team. But more than that, because the whole criminal trial was made into a documentary, the world was allowed to see a window into a place where we're usually not invited, exposing a department that railroaded a teenage kid, someone they knew was likely innocent, but men who were under such pressure to get the bust, to land that conviction, they were willing to do whatever it took, even to their own dishonor. After this debacle, interrogations, moving forward, they were all going to be filmed. A precedent that was set and is now widely accepted all over the country. But now there were no criminal charges filed against these detectives, but their careers, more or less, were ruined. And then this case took another unexpected turn. 4 months after that trial, It was actually Pat McGinnis, not the police, who solved this case. They received a tip that it was not one but two men who were involved with this murder. That after a long night of binging cocaine, they wanted to get more. So the two men drove around and by chance came upon Mr. and Mrs. Stevens. And apparently, they hadn't meant to kill Mrs. Stevens. Mrs. Stevens either threw or spilled her hot cup of coffee onto the gunman. And when it splashed on his neck, the hot coffee startled him and he accidentally pulled the trigger. Now, this story in this criminal case is also very complicated. But in the end, after 2 trials, the gunman, his name is Juan Curtis, was found guilty in that murder. And the other man took a plea, and both men are in prison for a very long time. As for the chain-smoking, straight-talking, ginger-haired Pat McGinnis, he left the world too soon, dying at the age of 70 just a few years ago. And after he died, even the people that he had torn apart on the witness stand had to admit he was a damn good attorney and a pretty nice guy. And if you go to his legacy page, which of course I did, you'll see people who, like me, watched the documentary and felt compelled to show their appreciation. And I will link to that legacy page in the show notes. As for Jean-Xavier and the rest of the French crew, they didn't have much time to reflect because they were already hard at work on their next case. And they'd specifically chosen a case that they thought was the absolute opposite of the Brenton Butler case. Here was a case of a rich man, Michael Peterson, in North Carolina, who had every single resource at his fingertips. And the French film crew might have imagined that a rich white guy with all of those resources would be able to get out of a murder trial pretty easily. But as you know, that is not what happened. In the case of Michael Peterson, would actually be more complicated, even more controversial, and span more than a decade of this documentarian's time. And I'm actually going to revisit the staircase for the bonus episode in May. And I know the Michael Peterson case has been covered a million times, but I'm confident that I found an angle that people might not have heard yet. And I so look forward to sharing it with you in the bonus episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, coming out soon in early May. Thanks again for listening, and as always, there's so much more in the original documentary, which again I have linked to in the show notes and encourage you to watch. Until next time, nighty-night.